Hello, my name is Max Ravitz. I'm a product specialist at Moog Music, and we're coming to you live from the Sound Lab in Asheville, North Carolina. Today, what we're going to be doing is looking at 4 of our instruments, the Moog Matriarch, the Subharmonicon, the Mother 32, and the DFAM. And because all 4 of these instruments have patch points, we're going to look a little bit at how to use them together and get some interconnectivity between all the instruments going. To begin, I'm going to start by tuning 3 of the instruments together. I'm going to use the Matriarch as a tuning reference, and then we're going to tune the Subharmonicon and the Mother 32. So to begin, I'm going to take the Matriarch and I'm going to turn its VCA mode into the drone. That way we can hear the oscillator. And I'm going to open the filter. So we just have a sawtooth droning. And now I'm going to do the same on the Mother 32. I'm going to turn the VCA mode to on. We have the Mother tuned. I'm going to also tune the Subharmonicon. So to do this, I'm going to hold the EG button on the Subharmonicon until it starts to blink, and that's going to put it into the drone mode. And I'm just going to listen to oscillator 1. So now I can hear oscillator 1's in tune. I'm going to check oscillator 2. Okay, so now I know that all of my instruments are in tune, so the next thing I'm going to do is make sure that the clock sources are the same for all 4 instruments. So for my clock distribution, I'm going to use the Subharmonicon as my master clock. And I'm going to patch the clock output from the Subharmonicon to this utility section in the Matriarch. There's a mult at the top. And this is going to allow me to take one signal and make 3 copies of it to send elsewhere. So the first destination that I'm going to send it to is the Matriarch itself. So I'm going to take this patch cable, and in the back, there's a small yellow section, and there's a clock in jack. So I'm going to go there. I'm going to take the second output, and I'm going to patch it to the tempo input on the Mother 32. And finally, I'm going to take my last mult output, and I'm going to go to the advanced clock input on the DFAM. So now I have the firmware 2.0 on the Mother 32, so I want to arm it for external clock. And to do that, I hit both the KB and the step buttons, and then I hit run, and that will arm it for external clock. I'm going to reset it to make sure it starts on step 1. On the DFAM, I'm going to hit the advanced button until I get to step 8, and then I'm going to hit run stop, and that will arm it for an external clock. And now, when I press play on the Subharmonicon, we can confirm that everything is synced. Okay, so now we've done the sort of more boring parts of this process, which is just confirming that everything's in tune and everything is synced. So let's look a little bit more at how I'm going to patch each instrument. And let's start with the Matriarch. So for this, I'm going to go back to the VCA mode, and I'm going to put it into the amplifier envelope, which just lets me know that this second envelope here is going to control the VCA. And I'm going to switch the paraphony mode to 4, and I'm going to make sure all 4 of my oscillators are set to a triangle wave. All 4 of them are set to the 4-foot setting in the octave selection. And then I'm going to turn all 4 oscillators up so that I can make sure that I hear them. So I can hear that I'm able to play nice 4-note polyphonic chords. So let's look at how I want to patch the Matriarch. One of the first things that I want to focus on is the filter. The filter section is actually a stereo filter if you want, or a dual filter depending on the settings that this switch selects. So for filter mode, in this case, I'm going to select a series high-pass, low-pass mode, which means that my filter 1 is going to be a high pass that then is fed into filter 2, which is going to act as a low pass. I want these 2 filters to behave a little bit independently from each other. And so I need to patch this a little bit to consider that, because currently, if I were to turn the envelope up, for instance, it would affect both my low pass and high pass. But I want to set it up so that it only controls my low pass filter, which is going to be my second filter. So to do this, I want to use the first envelope, which is our filter envelope. And I'm going to patch the envelope output from the filter section to this attenuator on the left side in the utilities section over here. What this attenuator is going to let me do is take the signal that I'm feeding into it, the envelope here, and allow me to control the strength of it, or even invert it if I wanted the envelope to push something downwards instead of upwards. So the next thing that I'm going to do is take the attenuator output, and I'm going to patch that to the cutoff 2 input. So now this attenuator knob is going to act like the envelope amount knob, but it's only going to affect our low-pass filter. So if I turn it up, and let me actually set the envelopes to be a little faster so we can hear the effect. So you can hear my filter is now opening, but the high pass is staying the same. And now, this spacing knob, which actually lets me control the offset between the 2 filters, so how far apart they're set when this cutoff knob controls both of them, will just let me adjust the cutoff of filter 1, which is my high pass filter. So now I can use that to tune out a little bit of the bass, because I really want this to be focused on more of the treble and higher mid-ranges, and eliminate some of my low end. The next thing that I want to do is add a little bit of vibrato to this patch. And for this, I'm going to use the modulation section. I have my rate set to not too fast of an LFO, and I have the waveform set to a sine wave. And I have the pitch knob, the pitch amount knob in the modulation section turned up just to the first tick mark here. So now when I turn up my modulation wheel, I'll get this nice slight warble to my notes. So I'm going to then extend my envelope back out to make it something a little bit longer. And now I'll have this nice kind of warbly pad. The next thing I want to do is incorporate some delay into this, and I'm going to use the Matriarch's own analog delay, which is a beautiful stereo delay, or it could be used as 2 independent mono delays. For this, I'm going to turn the ping pong on, which will make it work in stereo, and I'm going to sync it to the internal clock. And this will just give me a nice delay effect on top of my pads to kind of slew them as I change between different chords. This can be a nice way to cheat the Matriarch to sound like it has more than 4 voices, because as I'm playing all these 4-note chords, all of my oscillators are getting cut off from the previous chord, but the delay will let me leave a little bit of the previous chord in, so it will sound like a 8-voice polyphonic synth that has a lot of release on its envelope. And so that's pretty much how I want to set up the Matriarch. Next, let's look at the Subharmonicon. The first thing that I want to do is, again, hit this EG button so that I can put it into drone mode. I'm going to listen to just oscillator 1, and I want to tune the sub-oscillators to make a nice triad. So I'm going to turn all 3 up in the mixer section. You can hear I have a unison going between all 3 oscillators. And I'm going to adjust sub 1 freak and sub 2 freak to create chords on my sub-oscillators that relate to oscillator 1. So let's just listen to actually sub-oscillator 1 in the oscillator. So I'll do that 5th. So I like that chord for oscillator 1's section. So now let's listen to section 2. And I'm going to do the same thing. And now I'm going to listen to all 6 notes together. You can hear I have this nice, very rich chord happening. Another thing that I should mention is I'm also using these Auto Machines effects. This is the BAM and this is the BIM. I'm using this for reverb on all of the instruments. And then I'm using the BIM for delay on the Subharmonicon and the mother so that I don't have all 3 instruments going through the same delay. And I can set a little bit of a different setting between all of them. So the next thing that I want to do with the Subharmonicon is go through my chords and make sure that I've created a chord progression that I like with the sequencers. So to do that, I'm going to use the trigger button. And I'm going to play with these knobs until I'm happy with the intervals between each step of both sequencers. And I can use the next button to then move to the next step in the sequencer. Like that. I think that that sounds like a pretty progression, so I'm going to leave that. And you'll also notice in the quantizer section I've selected an 8-note equal tempered scale, which is just going to give me a major scale. That way it's a little bit easier to dial in note values on the sequencer, because otherwise I'll just have a lot more note values to hit, and this will restrict them to my notes in scale. So now, because I have a sense of the scale here, I can listen to my notes or my chords and be able to harmonize with the Matriarch. So you can hear we have a nice matched key going on here. So next, let's look a bit at the Mother 32. I have a pattern that I pre-programmed into the sequencer, so let's just listen to how it sounds. It's a simple ostinato pattern. Oh. Oh, whoops. The pattern saved somewhere else. So I'm going to use this pattern. And I want to do a few things patching-wise with the Mother 32. The first thing that I want to do is make sure that my assignable output is set to a stepped random so that I can get a nice modulation signal to send to a few different destinations to get some random movement. And to do that, I'm going to go into the settings menu by hitting Shift, Reset Accent, Set End, and Step 8. I'll know that I'm in the settings menu because you can see that the tempo LED is blinking yellow. I'm looking at the first page of settings, which I can see by this one LED being lit up yellow. And then I want to select step 8, which I see is already selected, but just to show you what it looks like if I select something else, I'm selecting step 8, so I have this green LED lit at the 8 position. I want to patch this now to a few different places, so I'm going to use the mult on the mother 32. So I'm going to take this assignable output, I'm going to patch it to the mult in here, and then I'm going to patch it to 2 places. The first is actually going to be the VC mix control, because I'm going to patch something into the VC mix. And then the second is going to be the cutoff input on my Subharmonicon. That way I can have this nice interrelated movement between the mother and the Subharmonicon as they play. The next thing that I'm going to do is patch the EG output, so the envelope output, into the mix 2 of the VC mix. And then I'm going to patch the VC mix out into our cutoff. And so now we can hear how this sounds. I'm going to have the same pattern, but my envelope modulation of the filter is going to randomly change as the sequencer moves through its steps. I think that this will give some nice movement to all of our patches. Now that I have that set up, we're going to look at the DFAM. I have a very simple just kick drum pattern going right now, and I'm going to add a little bit of modulation to change that. So for now, I'm going to pull the advanced clock just so I can listen to the DFAM on its own and let it run. So the first thing that I want to do is be able to add snare drum sounds to this. And so for this, I'm going to use the pitch sequencer, since I'm not actually going to use it to control the pitch of either oscillator. So I'll patch the pitch out here into the noise level. And so I have this 4/4 pattern. Let's say I want to create a snare on the 2 and 4 as is, a typical pattern. I can just go to this step 5 on the pitch sequencer and turn it up to add a snare. And you can do it on more subtle, or do it on other steps to make a subtle sort of snare pattern. So now that I have that set up, I also want to do something that will kind of emulate hi-hats or some sort of faster rhythmic pattern that will follow 16th notes. And so I'm going to do a little trick here where I'm going to patch from the DFAM to the Matriarch and then back to the DFAM. And so to do this, I'm going to take the trigger output from the DFAM. I'm going to go to this utility section on the right side of the Matriarch, and I'm going to patch to the attenuator input. And then I'm going to take that output, and I'm going to run it back into the VCA CV. So what this is going to do is feed a quick trigger into the VCA, even though it's already being opened by the envelope. And I'm going to get this little fast click that I can use this attenuator knob to add. So it's pretty much giving me a volume knob for this other element in my drum beat. So let's listen to what that's going to sound like. So now you can hear I can kind of get 3 different elements, a kick drum, a snare drum, and then this clicky hi-hat. The next thing that I want to do is incorporate oscillator 2 a little bit, because you can notice I have it turned off in the mixer section here. And what I want to use it to do is give me an extra layer that's underneath those other 3 drums that will give me some more metallic sounds, and I'm going to use FM here. So what I've done is I've tuned oscillator 2's frequency all the way up, and then I have the FM amount turned all the way up, so it's going to send the output of VCO1 into the FM input of VCO2. So oscillator 1 will modulate oscillator 2 here. And then what I want to do is use a little bit of modulation to bring that in and out of the mix. And I want to be able to attenuate how strong this modulation will occur. So for this, I'm going to use this secondary LFO on the Matriarch. And I'm going to patch the triangle out into the attenuator section on the left side of the instrument. And then I'm going to patch that attenuator output into the VCO2 CV so that it's going to move it around a little bit, and we'll be able to hear changes in the FM depth because the ratio between the two oscillators is going to change. So let's listen to what that's going to sound like. And if I remove our clicky hi-hat and I pull the kick out, and I'll pull the noise out for a second, that's essentially what oscillator 2 is doing. It's just giving me this kind of bassy, crunchy layer that's going to exist underneath my drum beat. So you can hear it, it has this nice subtle effect and kind of gives me a little bit of depth and variation over time as the drum beat repeats. So now that I have all of this set up, I'm going to play a little bit of music and just try to move through some patterns and hear how it all sounds incorporated together. So I'm going to make sure that everything is reset to the first step, and that my DFAM's on the 8th step. I'm going to patch my clock back into the DFAM. And now when I hit play on the Subharmonicon, I'll be able to start introducing all of these elements separately. yeah, as you can see, there's a lot of fun to be had and, areas to explore between the four instruments. And yeah, just lots of interesting interactivity between them. Obviously plenty that I haven't covered, but maybe this will give you a sense of how to approach exploration and how to approach patching some of these instruments together. Now I guess we will move into answering questions if anybody has any questions for me. Maybe get a nice little arpeggio playing in the background. I'm not seeing anything on the screen. Oh, okay. Or if nobody has any questions, I'll just keep playing around for a bit on the instruments. seeing some questions and being asked, so I'm going to answer them. The first one is, what do I think about the Subharmonicon? I think it's an instrument that takes a little bit of learning how it works to wrap your mind around it, and then once you do, there's a lot of potential inside of it. I mean, you have 6 oscillators. You can make beautiful chordal patterns or like really thick mono synthesizer sounds. You can use it as a duophonic synthesizer. The way that the rhythmic control works is super interesting, and I think as far as the instruments on the market out today, the Subharmonicon represents something really unique that no other instrument really does. So I think it's a wonderful instrument, particularly if you have any of the other Mother series instruments from us. Yeah, so it's great. I really love it. Am I running the new firmware on the Mother 32? Yes, I'm running the version 2.0 firmware. There's a lot of really nice things that have been added in terms of features. Let me just isolate it on its own. For one, I love the new play directions that you can do because you can make your sequences run forward, in reverse, in pendulum, or run randomly. And I can show you what that sounds like. Pull some of my patching. The 2 arrow buttons, and I hit 2, I can make the sequencer run in reverse. And if I hit the 3 button, I can make it do sort of a window wiper pendulum pattern where it will run forward and then backwards. And then if I hit the 4 button, I can make it totally run randomly, which can be really nice if you patch the keyboard output to make the VCF cutoff track the notes. So I think that that's a really nice addition. There's also things like auto-saving patterns, which I find really convenient. There's a lot more ways to deal with your clocking distribution and how the Mother 32 is handling clock, and more divisions on the clock divider. So if I were to, say, sync the Mother to the DFAM using the tempo input, and then I'll put the DFAM running. I'll just get a simple 4/4 pattern just to hear. So now that it's synced, I can get it to run at different divisions as well as select different triplet values or other values. Because I have it running at random, it becomes a little bit more subtle. But the way that it's handling clock is really far improved from the last firmware. And then just other little additions to the menu that become convenient, some visual feedback aspects for when you're erasing patterns or writing new patterns. And I really think it's a big improvement over the first firmware. Next would be, can you explain how round robin works on the Matriarch? And yes, I actually have round robin going now. So if I get a little arpeggiator set up, I'm going to set them all to a sawtooth. And as I change settings, once I have the arpeggiator running, you'll be able to hear what's nice about round robin. And that's when it's on, say you have an arpeggio running, each oscillator will play each note, and as the arpeggio runs, it will cycle through the oscillators. So then you can do things like set different settings for each oscillator as it plays, which will become a really nice performative feature. So now. So now, if I start setting different settings for the oscillators, you can slowly hear it changing. And then I can play with the octave location of each note in my arpeggio. Can do something like set 3 of my oscillators to one waveform and the 4th to another, so that I have this sort of accented note inside of my arpeggio. Because I know that each oscillator is making up one note in my arpeggio, if I pull an oscillator out, I can create a rhythmic pattern. So you can see round robin just allows you to add a lot of depth, especially when you're playing with a sequencer or arpeggiator. And one thing that I actually like to do is you can set up internally the setting so that round robin is always on. And then it becomes nice because you can even have a pattern play by just hitting one note, because that one note will get distributed to each oscillator. So you can have it apply to the notes that you play on the keyboard as well as the arpeggiator. So it becomes a really fun feature to play with. How does Subharmonicon work with MIDI? Oh, sorry. When you have a setup like this, what's the best way to deal with being able to alternate subdivisions on, say, DFAM? Well, that becomes a little bit of a tricky thing. I mean, if you have something like a clock divider that is an external module, that becomes a really convenient way to do it. Otherwise, you probably will always need to have 2 of the instruments running at the same division, but you can start, changing the divisions on the Subharmonicon or the mother and then have the DFAM follow that particular instrument. And it will allow you to have the 2 moving together, which can be convenient, say, if you have the mother and the DFAM with the mother playing a bass line that corresponds to the DFAM's rhythm. Then you can use the mother's new clock divider features to make the DFAM also follow different divisions. And obviously, because you have the outputs for each sequencer's trigger pattern, that can also be a nice way to get something that's more like a nonlinear compound rhythm and not just a straight rhythm. But yeah, also being able to just add a Eurorack module that will do different clock divisions can get you a lot of flexibility, where if you're running off one clock, you can divide it and be able to feed different divisions of that master clock to each of the instruments independently, which becomes really flexible. Which of these instruments would you buy first and why? I think that really comes down to what you want to accomplish. Each one of these instruments has its strengths and has its limitations. So I would say if you're focusing, obviously if you want something really flexible, the Matriarch is the most flexible of the 4 instruments, just given everything that you have, all the patch points and the features and the ways that you can reroute things. This would be the most flexible. I think that the Mother 32 is probably the most all-around good place to start, because it gives you a really clear view of subtractive synthesis, and the signal path is laid out really well. You have a nice 32-step sequencer and patching points. So if you're trying to learn signal flow and synthesis, and a little bit of how semi-modular synthesizers work as a way to dip your toes into fully modular synthesizers. The Mother-32 is really excellent. If you'd like to experiment with more non-traditional approaches to rhythm and like chordal movement, I think the Subharmonicon is a really good instrument to get lost in. You get to learn things like compound rhythms and just dealing with polyrhythmic content and learning how paraphonic voices work and how the sub-oscillators work. So you get to deal with alternate tunings, alternate approaches to timing, and definitely something that would be a little bit weirder than something like the Mother-32, which is a little bit more straightforward. And then if you're really focused on making more rhythmic patches, the DFAM is definitely the front runner there. Not that it's not capable of doing really wonderful melodic stuff, but it's definitely set up to be focused on drum synthesis and more rhythmic patterning. But I would say if you have no experience with synthesizers, that the Mother-32 is really an excellent starting point to gain an understanding and then expand outward from there through other instruments in the series. How does the Subharmonicon work with MIDI? I don't have one on me, but the MIDI in-jack actually works with a little 3.5 to MIDI adapter. So you can take a regular DIN MIDI cable, plug it into the adapter, and then plug it into the MIDI in. This would allow you to get clocking going in via MIDI, as well as being able to control the two voices over MIDI duophonically, which I think is really nice. And some people become very focused on the chordal capabilities of the Subharmonicon, but it really also excels as a mono or duophonic synth. And as a mono synth, you can end up with 6 oscillators in unison, or be able to get these interesting intervals to emulate things like chord memory, where you develop a chord shape and then can move it around as if it was a monophonic synthesizer, or being able to do duophony, where each oscillator has 2 oscillators to add. There's just a lot of power that's not necessarily obvious at first once you start incorporating MIDI into the Subharmonicon. It really makes it much more powerful. And maybe for some people who don't have music theory down as well, it allows you to really control it from a keyboard and be able to have that point of reference, which makes things easier for some people, for sure. Okay, I hope that I have answered everybody's questions and that I've, gotten you excited about the possibilities and potential that these instruments offer. And I'll set up another little pattern and everybody enjoy their day.